Now, this will be my second analogy to a Pacific Northwestern tree. Can you imagine? I don't know what's happening to me. But this one is not about a redwood, but a lodgepole pine. Now, a lodgepole pine is one of a few trees that has a very particular cone called a serotinous cone. So there's the lodgepole pine, and then there's a pine cone that's serotinous on the left and a normal pine cone on the right. Now, the difference between a serotinous cone is a regular cone might look like this in a particular season of its life, as every pine cone does. They're small, they're together, then they open and seeds get released. What's unique about a serotinous cone is they do not have a normal life cycle. They stay sealed shut until something. Now, I asked this question in the first service. Who here knows about a serotinous cone and what causes it to open up? Anybody? Not you. You're cheating. You were here first service. You were here first service. You knew, though? Okay. So one of us knew. Okay. Who? Harper knows? What? What is it, Harper? Well, guess. Give me a guess. No bad guesses. Harper, you're leaving me hanging in real time on camera. I won't leave you hanging anymore. All right, so a serotinous cone, the reason it's not like this cone is it can stay this way for years. Sealed, shut. It's got this thick layer of resin that keeps everything in tight. And that resin doesn't melt or move away in order for it to open except under one circumstance, and that circumstance is extreme heat that is typically found in a forest fire. The only way the pine cone opens to release new seed is when it's being burned. Okay. Well, that makes for an uncomfortable analogy, yet a true one. A true one. Oh, when the temperature reaches about 113 degrees, then the resin starts melting. The cones open and millions of seed get released. Now, for a casual observer like me, a forest fire looks like total destruction. But in reality, the very thing, the fire that appeared to destroy the forest, became a catalyst for the forest renewal. I didn't see that in real time, maybe. I didn't understand what God understands. It just looks devastating to me. The very thing, what looked like the end of the forest was actually the beginning of a new forest. So, as we read the word today, we're going to see a raging fire that's about to be unleashed on the early church. We're going to go back to the final verse of chapter 7 and then move into chapter 8. Then he fell on his knees and cried out with a loud voice, speaking of Stephen, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Having said this, he fell asleep. Now Saul approved of putting Stephen to death. First part of chapter 8. This is why you just can't trust chapter breaks and verses. It makes no sense to start the next chapter saying, now Saul approved of putting Stephen to death. Kind of connected to Stephen's death, don't you think? That we introduced this character named Saul. Stephen breathes his last. Before we can even process his death, Luke shifts our attention to the name of another man, Saul. And Stephen's final words are words of forgiveness. Do not hold this sin against them. Meanwhile, Saul stands there approving a murder. Just a little contrast for you. From every perspective, kind of like with the forest fire, this appears to be destruction. It looks like darkness has won. And sometimes in your life, it looks this way in a moment, that darkness is somehow prevailing over light. Where's the light? And God, where are you? Happens to us. The church here has now lost one of its brightest young leaders in Stephen. And at the same time, we see a new enemy emerge. Well, I've got lost in the enemy gaining ground. That's what it looks like in life. But Luke wants us to see something different. What looked like the church's greatest setback, and let's be honest, it was the church's greatest setback. It became the catalyst for the church's greatest advance, which is how God wants to turn things around in your life. The fire of persecution has come to this church. I mean, it has come. But instead of consuming the church, it's about to melt the resin of that pine cone and release some seed. So we've watched, by way of recap, the enemy attack the church. I mean, every possible imaginable way. The enemy was more creative than I would have come up with. Let's see. Let's attempt corruption. How about opposition? Let's try imprisonment. Let's try threats. Let's try martyrdom. And now Luke shows us the one thing that I don't think the enemy ever anticipated, because God is amazing. And here's the big idea. What the enemy intends to stop, God uses to advance his kingdom. The tactics that the enemy uses to stop it, God uses the same tactics against the enemy. Now, let's see how this unfolds. Now, very cool. Last week, I'm doing one series, Unstoppable. Last week, I read 68 verses. Today, I'm going to read 5 and only preach from 4. It's amazing. Amazing. But it's rich. I had to read the whole sermon last week. I don't have to read the whole sermon today. So he's going to show us 3 movements, is Luke, that prove the church was never stopped. It was simply sent. Not stopped, but sent. Part 1, the persecution began. Let's read 1 through 3 of our 4 verses. And on that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and mourned loudly for him, but Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and he would drag away men and women and put them in prison. Now, just verse 1 alone. On that day, a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. What day is that? The day Stephen died. That's the day. On that day. Now, I thought we've already been seeing persecution. Like persecution again and again. The word would say no, that was some trouble, but this is a great persecution. And the great persecution came on the day that they grieved. Think about that. Stephen's blood had barely dried before a great persecution began on that day. That's just not fair, is it? Almost as if it was tactical. One martyr in this church became the signal of the enemy for a widespread assault. So it wasn't a slow burn, if you think of a forest fire. This was an explosion. So until now, we've seen isolated opposition, people brought in before the Sanhedrin. Those days are quite simply over. This was the first organized persecution of people who called themselves Christians. It was open season in Jerusalem on anyone who believed in Jesus Christ. 2 and 3. Some devout men buried Stephen and mourned loudly for him, but Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and he would drag away men and women and put them in prison. And Luke pauses. There's an interruption in our story with this statement. Some devout men buried Stephen and mourned loudly for him. One interesting note that I will touch on, it's not here, but they weren't allowed to have a traditional Jewish burial service for someone stoned for blasphemy. So they did this at great personal peril and against all regulation to give him a burial. And consider, this is the first ever Christian funeral. First. First time they ever thought, well, what do we say? I assume it looked very similar to what they had in Jewish faith because that's all they knew, but they added a little flavor of Jesus on it. Very interesting. The very first time this young church had buried one of its own. Very first time this young church knew real loss, real grief, as we all are aware of, and we have it. But this was their first time. And I want to be careful because I'm preaching unstoppable faith, unstoppable church, unstoppable advance today. But I don't want to paint a picture in that context of a Christianity that doesn't bleed. Because unstoppable does not mean painless. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And they weren't stoic in the loss of Stephen. They did not pretend everything was okay. They did not try to put on face. It says that they mourned loudly. That would be wailing and travailing at the first loss. That's how this community looked. And then Luke immediately pivots with, Saul began ravaging the church, ravaging them in their loud mourning. Did I say it isn't fair that the enemy doesn't fight fair? His tactics aren't fair? Into grief stormed Saul. Unfortunately, when you are at your lowest is exactly when the enemy will pounce the quickest, because he wants to exploit you in your vulnerable state. If you are vulnerable, your only strength to find is the people of God. It says that when you grieve, we grieve. When you celebrate, we celebrate, because there's strength in the we. But if you grieve alone, you will get knocked out, because what the enemy is attempting to do is get you to quit. The reason that this keeps escalating is because the enemy of God, and this time through his agent Saul, because he was operating for the enemy, was to get the people of faith to stop. So I'm going to pounce on your grief. Exploiting them. Hearts are hurting. My emotion is raw. My questions are unanswered. My tears haven't even hit the floor yet when the pressure from the enemy comes at me the hardest. Not fair. And yet tactic. Don't be ignorant of the schemes of the enemy. He assumed that the pain would produce a surrender, not surrender to God, a surrender as in stopping. He assumed that my grief and your grief, that it would silence your faith. But we won't let that happen. Now, the word ravaging, only time it's ever used in the New Testament. When you see a word that stands unique, you need to figure out why. What's what we say here? It's like a beast that's tearing apart its prey. It's ravaging. And it has an echo to a Hebrew context in Psalm 80 when the people of God are described as the vineyard of God. And it says a wild boar from the forest came and ravaged the vineyard. The enemy that we don't see coming to pounce and exploit us in your vulnerable time, to ravage our life, to get us to stop. But we will not stop. Saul wasn't merely having a disagreement in a public forum with some folks. He was hunting them house to house, knocking on doors, family after family, man and woman alike, meaning none are exempt. Likely old and young. So imagine, put yourself in their shoes, that you're living in Jerusalem at this time, and when we have a gathering, as we're supposed to in faith, to take communion and remember the Lord and to worship, I imagine they had to start trying to do that in secret, and were very guarded with the time and place. Because they didn't know as they were gathering if Saul would knock on their door. And they didn't know if whatever knock came to the door might be Saul to put them in prison. And I think that we miss this somehow when we're reading how serious and vast this was. This was a great persecution, universally applied. The darkest moment that this young church has experienced so far, and it isn't close, is right now. And when the fire comes to your life, you know what you don't ever get? A notice. You don't get a heads up. And I've said this analogy before. It's just true. It's a good analogy because I like sports. Both in boxing and football, they say that the hit that hurts the most and does the most damage is the one you didn't see coming. There is actually a knack and talent in football, especially, rather than boxing too, to absorb a blow because you perceive the blow. When you don't perceive the blow, it has a tendency to knock you off your feet. And they didn't see the blow. And if that happens, and I should say when that happens, we often say, God, where are you? I don't think that's strange for us to say that. We're in the middle of darkness. Where is the light? And I like to highlight what isn't in a place because I contrast it with what would be in my life if I was in those shoes. Luke never says this, the church lost control, because when I'm waylaid, I might have a tendency to want to lose control. It never says God's plan was interrupted. You see, when I'm waylaid, I don't perceive plans of God. He never says the enemy gained the upper hand. Well, when I'm down on my back, I think the enemy just gained the upper hand. But none of that's in Acts. Luke is doing this matter-of-factly, persecution without panic, because Luke already knows that this is a story that God is writing and how God perceives it. So a fire has begun. A fire is at your doorstep. And Saul thought he was burning a forest down. I mean, he believed this. And all the people, if you just saw the smoke, you would believe something's being destroyed. But it wasn't. God never saw a dying forest is the point. The perspective that we're lacking in our trial, God still has. And God saw seeds about to be released. Part 2, the church scattered. I love this one. And now we're going to go back to verse 1. I'm only preaching 4 verses so I can do whatever I want to do. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. It is amazing, as I've preached the rest of this, how much import is in so few words. So understand, this is a transition chapter for the story of Acts, and it's a transition for the history of the church. A major shift is happening in a few verses. So imagine the scene. Again, I don't think that we give this justice sometimes as we read the words on a page because there's so few. But families hurriedly gathering all that they could carry to get out of Dodge as fast as possible, meaning they're leaving behind home and valuables. They're only taking what they can to go. Parents are trying to hurry and get their children. They're literally every agenda that they've had in life is suddenly completely severed as they try to flee. Imagine these people hurriedly saying goodbye as they hit the road, not even knowing exactly where they're headed to. They didn't know if they were coming back, and this has been their only home. Their livelihood, their relationships. And in a moment, leaving. Look, this Jerusalem is where Pentecost happened. Thousands came to Christ. It's where the apostles taught every single day, and now leaving. Something is shifting. Now, when a shepherd is struck, what happens to the flock? When an enemy army destroys and strikes an opposing army, what happens to the defeated army? Saul and the enemy in real time think that they have won, because it didn't say they scattered people. It says they scattered the church. Looks like a win for Saul. Working perfectly, this plan, this strategy, exploiting their grief. I struck them, they fled. Because the enemy, especially Saul in the context of what's going on in Jerusalem, they still are stuck in a faith that's at a temple. The presence of God no longer resided in a temple. And he did not understand that perspective. And that perspective is massive. So, they packed their bags, they left their jobs, they abandoned their homes, a mass exodus. So when you read these few pages, do you picture this? Because it says that 3,000 got saved at the first gospel message, a couple thousand at the second. Now that's men only. So we're up to 7,000, let's say. Let's say a household is just 3 people, and it's probably, let's say it's 4. All right, so if it's 7,000 men, that's 28,000. Now, it says also that beyond that, you had people coming to the Lord every day. I said 30,000 the first service. I think I'm going to put this up to 40,000. Let's just imagine 40,000. 40,000 believers in Jerusalem. And it says in the moment of this great persecution, they left. Do you think of 40,000 people leaving in a mass exodus of Jerusalem when you read these verses? Probably not. Now, what was Jesus' last command in Acts chapter 1 before he ascended into the sky? Oh, well, let's recall it. Verse 8 of chapter 1. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and Samaria, and as far as the remotest part of the earth, and power, check. Jerusalem, check. And okay. Now we're getting somewhere. The commission of Jesus always included Judea and Samaria, but up until this point, they have yet to cross a border. Not one, no story in the Bible yet of anybody crossing outside of Jerusalem. It's been Jerusalem-centric. Did I say this is a shift? A major shift? They loved, you see, what God was doing in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was home. Jerusalem was comfortable. And I just want to suggest this to you, that you could have success in life and it feel comfortable and it look like you have favor, and you may even have favor. You can even have success in God, meaning your faith is progressing. You study your word. You might even teach your word. You might even share the gospel. You might do all the things that are positive in God and project in one time what would be worldly successfully and godly successful. You're like the American dream of church. And yet not be on God's assignment at the same time. Because God is missional. And God cares much more for obedience than he does for sacrifice. He cares much more that you do what he's called you to do than you get better in life, even in the things of God. I love what we're doing at Life Church. I'm just going to be happy. No. How about this? Until this point, God had been bringing people in. 3,000 saved, 2,000 saved, added daily. reeling them in. Now God says, I'm ready to cast you out. I've been bringing you in, but now it's time to send you, which has always been the heart of God. Who will go for me and who shall I send? And that not one chair is missed on that statement, that question by God. Now, they end up in Judea and Samaria, it said. Judea familiar, Judea is okay. And for the people who ended up in Judea, they got it better. But Samaria is a problem. Samaria wasn't simply another town. No God-fearing Jew would go to Samaria. They avoided it like the plague. The prejudice that existed between the Jews and the Samaritans were greater, far greater than any prejudice you could imagine that we have today along racial lines in America. And interestingly enough, they aren't even a fully racial divide. There's some ethnic divide, a greater religious divide. So the people of Jerusalem, they would not go to Samaria voluntarily, probably. How about this, Life Church? If we were part of the church in Jerusalem at the time, new believers in Jesus Christ, and we got together and started doing some strategy. I got Andrew and Bernadette. We talked about outreach and taking mission trips. You know what mission trip we wouldn't be planning? Samaria. And as the elders got together, the church, and we started talking about budget planning and what we're going to set aside money for and plan for, you know what we wouldn't have been budgeting for? A trip to Samaria. And they didn't either. See, they were having a success that was until then yet short of their calling. The calling was in Acts chapter 1. All the success. It was amazing success. Pentecost. The man healed at the gate of the temple. The thousands of people coming to God. It says they had favor with men. The success is incredible, and yet the success wasn't the call. They had yet to fulfill the call of God. And that could be said of all of us. Do not be content with just a little progress of faith and progress in this world. Strive and seek for the calling and purpose and destiny of God upon your personal life, because that's what actually matters. Obedience. You know, when the fire hit them, you know what the fire didn't ask for? Their strategic plans, their budget, their ministry goals, their relationship goals. You got relationship goals? Their fitness goals, their wealth goals, their retirement plan. The fire doesn't care about any of all of that. None of it. Unfortunately, as with the people of Israel in the Old Testament, sometimes it absolutely takes an external pressure to re-engage us to the fullness of God's purpose for us. We get off track into comfort so easily. But a pressure has a tendency to collapse your routine, because your routine is meaningless in the face of pressure. When you're grieving loudly, your routine doesn't even exist. Now, on the theme of the big shift, who did it says was scattered? It said, go back to it, verse 1. Yeah. And they were all scattered, all except the apostles. That is fascinating. Apostles stay in Jerusalem, but who goes? Everyone else. That would be ordinary people. That would be people like us. Shopkeepers, bookkeepers, mothers, fathers, children, tradesfolk, widows, professionals, young people, all people, everyone that wasn't an apostle. Because the mission was never meant to be burdened by 12 men. We've been building to this, but it just explodes in Acts chapter 8 in a transition, interestingly, from Stephen. Stephen is a bridge. Stephen was the first one we see preaching, proclaiming, enough so that he got brought before the Sanhedrin, who wasn't an apostle. And he serves as the bridge for what's about to happen. It says that signs and wonders accompanied his proclamation of the gospel. We've only seen signs and wonders at the hands of the apostles. We've only seen teaching at the hands of the apostles. We've only seen signs and wonders at the hands of the apostles until Stephen's death. And then we get this immediate pivot from Stephen to everyone left except the apostles. That is why this is like a cliff ledge transition. This isn't a gentle transition. It's a major shift. The church scattered because the church is the people. It didn't say some folks scattered. It says the church scattered except the apostles. So when the fire hits that lodgepole pine, and it has, the cones don't simply open, and this is the truth. The cone doesn't like a regular pine cone. Under heat, it starts sizzling. And as it gets a little chaotic, and there's a whole lot of kinetic energy happening on the inside of that thing under temperature until it steeds everywhere. Scattered. Burst. You know what it looks like this does? It looks violent. It looks chaotic. A lot of kinetic energy. It looks like destruction. That's what it looked like when 40,000 people rapidly flee a place. But it wasn't destroying anything. It was breaking open what until then had remained closed, part of the purpose of God. You know, they did not leave Jerusalem on some well-funded mission journey. They weren't on an excursion. They were violently thrust out of their comfort zones. Part 3. The gospel advanced, which is why this is called Unstoppable Advance, final sermon of this Unstoppable Church series. Verse 4, first time reading this verse, last verse. Therefore, those who had been scattered went through places preaching the word. Praise God. They simply would not stop. They simply would not shut up. Would not stop preaching about this gospel. Luke, again, I love what's not said. Luke doesn't say they scattered until things cooled off. Luke does not say they scattered to find safety. He doesn't say they scattered to build a new life. Instead, a people whose lives have been turned upside down. Come on now. A people who've lost their homes, a people who've lost livelihoods, a people who've lost relationships. Luke says those same people just went through places preaching the word. That is incredible. Absolutely phenomenal. Now, I just am going to submit that, like me, you don't read this and consider just at face value exactly how incredible what you're reading is. Until now, the only preaching have been apostles. Until now, the only location of that preaching have been Jerusalem. God says, no, this isn't burdened by a few, and it's not to be contained in a place. It's to be universal, and it's to be to all. That means we all own it. The word here, preaching, is not doing what I'm doing, meaning I'm giving a presentation at a time in a formal setting at a place that you knew you were coming to, a service. They had those in synagogues, and later Paul would go to them and making a Christian appeal. That is a different word in the Greek. This would be a word for evangelism, meaning that they were sharing the good news, meaning this, as they fled to seek new places to live, new jobs, new relationships, everywhere they went, every place, they simply shared about the good news of Jesus Christ. over coffee at their shop, at your shop, as their kids learned in school together. The parents spoke, the kids spoke. As they lived in every place they went that was away from Jerusalem, they simply shared the good news of Jesus Christ. And so will we. The very people Saul and the enemy wanted to silence became the people who carried the message of the gospel further than it had ever been, which is why the next series is going to be called Uncharted, because it begins a chapter of the church where everything is something they've never been. By God's design, by the command of Jesus, go into Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost ends of the earth. So we just finished, if Acts was in only a few chapters, we just finished, or say sections, we just finished section 1. And now we're going to Judea and Samaria. That would be section 2. So remember the last pole pine one more time, because now this is the illustration that whole thing was begging for. The fire melted the resin, the cone opened, the seeds fall. And what looked like destruction became instead multiplication. And that's how God will work in your life, even when it looks like destruction. Think about it. Every time Saul knocked on a door to drag a believer to prison, all he did was shake another pine cone until that seed scattered. Every door was another scattered seed. Every single time, what he thought was a victory instead was a great defeat. Because here it is, God's the master strategist. The enemy wanted to exploit your weakness to get you to stop and to get you scattered. God, at the same time, was using the tactic of the enemy to advance the gospel. He was turning tables on his own strategy. The very strategy he thought was working, God used to work for him instead. God had turned the tables. I don't know if that logic is working, but I hope you can see that. His best strategy, God used against him. The enemy thought he was scattering the church, but God instead said, no, I'm just sowing the gospel. Scattering from one person looks one way, but scattering to another person looks like something else. What we've seen this now. Basically, what the enemy meant for evil, God was turning for good. And not just good, he was turning it to mission. He was using it for his own advance. It was not retreat. It was a great counterattack by God to launch the church in the phase that he had been waiting for already. Come on. And who's preaching here? We've talked about it, but it's not John. It's not Peter. Luke simply says those who had been scattered. Those same ordinary folks are the ones advancing the gospel now, not the apostles. See the shift. So it's not just a shift in location. It's a shift in who's burdening the gospel. God is always wanting to offload the burden of ministry from the few to the mass, because he's all about advancing his kingdom. And we then have to be careful, you and me both, that I don't shoulder too much and that you don't ask too much of me. We're in this together. So, you know what the gospel's dependent on? Ordinary people talking about Jesus. If we grew as a church because I was that dynamic, I had such an aura, I had such an attraction and whatever I could bring, which we all know is not true, then what we would do in growth is simply have a cult of personality. And we could have a cult of personality with growth. It would not be a good growth. It would be superficial. It would not be a real solid growth. Instead, we don't want a church that grows because a pastor preaches once a week. We want a church that grows because every believer starts scattering every Monday morning. So let's take what we've just read from Acts and apply it to our life every day. We're going to gather on Sunday and scatter on Monday. We're going to scatter. And I'm not talking about scatter like flee. I'm talking like scatter like go and sow some seeds in every place. Scattering. Neighborhoods, scatter. At school, scatter. Office, scatter. Ball fields, scatter. Coffee shops, scatter. At dinner, scatter. Monday scatters us. Sunday gathers us. So today, you gather some seed. Tomorrow, you scatter some seed. The gospel, the gospel, the gospel, which is how Jesus designed the whole thing. And we're going to do it. So, quick series review. The enemy attacked their holiness. God purified his church. Unstoppable purity. The enemy attacked their courage. God instead gave them boldness. Unstoppable perseverance. The enemy attacked their priorities. Brought some distraction. But God protected the mission. Unstoppable priority. The enemy attacked their witness in Stephen, hoping to silence it, but God instead multiplied it. It's an unstoppable witness. Hold that. See, the story of Stephen, this grief, this amazing conviction, who would stand and be martyred for the gospel, is far more significant than just the story. It sits as a bridge between a church that was burdened entirely by apostles and a church that's sent into a world. The story of Stephen serves as a bridge of what was entirely upon just Jerusalem. Let me put it to you this way. The story of Stephen, I said that wrong, of this one man's martyrdom became the bridge and linchpin from a ministry burden on apostles to all. The story of Stephen, one man's martyrdom, became the linchpin and bridge of a story that was all about Jerusalem to a story that was sent to the world. The first martyrdom wasn't small, and it didn't result in something small. It changed history. How about this? If there had not been on that day of Stephen's death, a great persecution, we might not be talking about Jesus right here today. See, the greatest seed in all of this story was the blood of Stephen on the ground. There's something unique about the blood of the martyrs to do something great and profound in a place. This is a true thing. You can see anecdotally how this has happened throughout history. Where there's blood on the ground, there's rich soil for faith to grow. I'm telling you, that's what's really happened. Again, what the enemy thought he was silencing, all he did was release seeds. And that's what he wants to do with us. And then the last one. Every attack, just another advance. Unstoppable advance for this unstoppable church. Unstoppable. We'll land this plane here. The enemy started a fire. But when he didn't understand the kind of forest he was dealing with. He doesn't understand how we're wired. He doesn't understand the God we serve. But our God understands him fully. He's always a step ahead. He's always seeing bigger. He's always beyond what the enemy sees. Every flame that the enemy has sent to try to destroy you is just opening another cone. Every believer who was forced to leave a place simply became a new missionary sent to a field, a place. Every town they entered became the new Jerusalem where the gospel of Jesus was being proclaimed and taught. Every time, over and over again, in a moment in time, in 4 verses, this thing just exploded. on the day of great persecution. So the church has never been unstoppable because it avoids fire, unfortunately. Don't you wish that no fire was necessary? That would be the faith I would prefer. No fire necessary. But it's unstoppable, though, because the king of the church is greater than every fire. Every fire. They tried to stop the church with hypocrisy. They tried to stop the church with threats. They tried to stop the church with prison. They tried to stop the church with death. They tried to stop the church with persecution. And it looks like blow, 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 blow. But they did not stop. That's why it's called unstoppable. Never, ever did they stop. They did not stop teaching, preaching, and proclaiming Jesus Christ. And every attempt to stop it only served to advance it. From Acts 1 to Acts 8, Luke's been telling this story. The church of Jesus Christ is unstoppable. Come on, Life Church. Give the Lord a hand clap. Stand up in this place.